The wind swept across the dry Arizona plains, carrying with it the smell of dust, pine, and faint wood smoke from a distant Apache camp. The sun was sinking low over the red cliffs, painting the land in hues of gold and blood. A lone cowboy rode through that vast emptiness, his hat pulled low, his shirt torn, and his wrists bound by rawhide rope. His horse had been taken, his gun stripped from its holster, and the marks of a long struggle showed on his face. Every few steps the warrior leading him tugged at the rope, forcing him to walk faster. Behind them, 3 other Apache men followed, their expressions cold and unreadable, their eyes scanning the horizon for threats that weren't there. The cowboy didn't know how far they had come, or where they were taking him. He had stopped asking questions hours ago. The desert had a way of drying up both sweat and hope, and the silence of his captors told him that words would do no good. The only sound was the steady crunch of boots and moccasins against the hard ground. When the hills finally broke open into a valley, he saw the Apache village. Smoke rose from the fires, children ran barefoot among the lodges, and dogs barked at the sudden arrival of strangers. The smell of roasted maize and pine pitch hung thick in the air. For a moment, the cowboy thought of the small towns he had passed in his travels, dusty places with a general store, a saloon, and a church bell that marked the passing of Sundays. But this place was different. There was order here, pride, and a silence that spoke louder than the noise of any frontier town. As they entered the camp, people came out of their lodges, whispering and pointing. He felt their eyes on him, sharp, questioning, and suspicious. To them, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a trespasser, a symbol of the trouble that had come to their lands in recent years. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of history and hurt. The warriors brought him to a wide clearing where a tall man stood waiting, the chief. His hair was streaked with gray, his face carved with the lines of a life spent between peace and war. He wore no crown, no decoration, just the steady authority that came from being obeyed. Around him, the council gathered in silence. Women, elders, and young men all formed a ring, their faces lit by the last light of day. They pushed the cowboy to his knees before the chief. Dust rose around him and clung to the sweat on his neck. One of the warriors spoke in Apache, his voice sharp and fast. Though the cowboy didn't understand the words, he knew what was being said. They were telling the story, how they found him near the river, how a shot had been fired, and how one of their own now lay dead because of it. The cowboy tried to speak. "It wasn't me," he said, his voice hoarse from thirst. "I didn't shoot him." "I swear on my life," the chief didn't reply. He looked down at the cowboy with eyes that gave nothing away. For a long moment, the entire camp was silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She carried a clay bowl of water and knelt beside the cowboy. Her dark eyes met his briefly before she offered the bowl. He hesitated, unsure if it was a kindness or a test, but thirst won out and he drank. When he handed it back, she gave a small nod and returned to her place. That was when he saw her, the chief's daughter. She stood a little apart from the others, her hair braided with leather and beads that glimmered in the firelight. There was quiet strength in her face, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even doubt. She couldn't have been more than 20, but her gaze was steady and searching, as if she were trying to see the truth beneath the dust and fear that clung to the stranger before her. The chief finally spoke, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. "You came to our land with a gun," he said in broken English. "Now one of my sons is dead. You tell me, why should I let you live?" The cowboy lifted his eyes, his heart pounding. "Because I didn't come here to fight," he said. "I came looking for a missing man, a ranch hand who disappeared near the river. I thought maybe he'd been taken, but—" He stopped, knowing how that sounded. "I didn't mean harm to your people," murmurs rippled through the crowd. The chief's face remained unreadable. "You say you came in peace," he said slowly. "But peace does not walk with a rifle." The cowboy took a breath. "Out here, Chief, no man travels without one, not if he wants to live." There was truth in that. The land was wild, filled with dangers that didn't care what flag or tribe a man belonged to. But truth didn't always matter when blood had been spilled. The chief turned to his council and spoke quietly in Apache. The others nodded, some in agreement, others in anger. Finally, he raised his hand for silence. "The council will decide," he said. "But tonight the spirits of the dead must be heard." 2 warriors grabbed the cowboy by the arms and dragged him toward a post at the center of the clearing. They tied his hands behind him and bound him to the wooden stake. The firelight flickered against his face, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. The people watched in silence, their eyes reflecting both grief and fury. The chief's daughter moved closer, her expression unreadable. The cowboy looked at her, searching for some sign of mercy. She said nothing, only stared at him as the drums began to beat, slow and steady like a heartbeat. As the night deepened, the air grew heavy with smoke and song. The Apache elders chanted prayers to the spirits, calling for guidance. The cowboy's throat was dry, his mind racing. He thought of the wide plains of Texas, of his father's small ranch, of the simple life he had left behind. He had come west chasing work and adventure, not knowing he'd end up bound before a tribe that saw him as a murderer. When the chanting stopped, the chief stood again. "The spirits have heard," he said. "At dawn we will judge him. If he speaks truth, he will walk free. If not," he didn't finish. He didn't have to. The people began to drift back to their lodges, the crowd thinning until only the guards remained. The cowboy's body ached from the ropes, but his mind refused to rest. He could see the chief's daughter standing by the edge of the firelight, watching him with that same quiet intensity. Finally, she stepped forward, her shadow long against the sand. The guards moved to block her, but she raised her hand and they stepped aside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night was silent, except for the crackle of the dying fire. Then she came close enough for him to see the glimmer of tears in her eyes. She looked at him for a long time, not with hate but with something softer, something that looked a lot like conflict. And then she said 4 words, her voice barely above a whisper. Those 4 words changed everything. The guards turned sharply, hearing the tone but not the meaning. The cowboy stared at her, stunned, trying to understand whether what she'd said meant mercy, truth, or something far more dangerous. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. The chief's daughter stepped back, her face now hidden by the shadows, and before he could ask her what she meant, she was gone, leaving him tied to the post, heart pounding, with the weight of her words echoing in his mind and the uncertain dawn drawing near. The night was long and cold, and the cowboy didn't sleep. The ropes cut deep into his wrists, and each shift sent a dull ache up his arms. But it wasn't the pain that kept him awake. It was the memory of those 4 words the chief's daughter had spoken. He replayed them again and again, trying to find meaning. He didn't know the Apache tongue, but there had been something in her tone. Something that didn't sound like condemnation. Maybe it was a warning. Or maybe it was the faint spark of mercy in a place that had none. The stars hung sharp and bright above the village, scattered like broken glass across the dark sky. He could hear the distant murmur of voices from the lodges, the soft cry of an infant, the bark of a dog. This wasn't a savage place, he thought. It was a home. These people had families, laughter, lives, and yet here he was, tied up in the center of it all, waiting for dawn to bring his fate. He thought of the trail that had brought him here, the dusty road from Fort Bowie, the dry gulches, the broken fences, and the rancher who'd begged him to help find a missing hand. The boy's name was Eli, young and quiet, the kind who never made trouble. He'd gone out riding near the San Pedro River and never came back. Folks whispered it was the Apaches, but the cowboy hadn't believed it. He'd seen too many lies told about native raids. Most started by frightened men with too much whiskey and too little truth. So he'd gone looking, thinking maybe the boy had just gotten lost. But near the river, he'd found tracks, moccasin prints and hoof marks mixed together. And then the sound of gunfire had cracked through the canyon walls. He'd dropped to the ground, crawled toward the noise and found chaos. Smoke rising, a dead horse, and an Apache warrior lying still by the rocks. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but that hadn't mattered when the others came riding out of the trees. They saw a white man with a gun standing over one of their own, and that was enough. The memory hit him hard now. The look in that fallen warrior's eyes, young, proud, and lifeless. The cowboy swallowed hard. He didn't know if Eli was dead or alive. He didn't even know if the boy had ever been here. The fire in the center of the village had burned down to embers when he heard footsteps approaching. 2 guards stood nearby, but they didn't stir. A small figure slipped out from the shadows, the chief's daughter. She moved quietly, her moccasins barely whispering against the earth. In her hand, she carried a small leather pouch and a folded blanket. She knelt beside him, her face dimly lit by the glow of the dying fire. "You should not speak," she said softly, her English halting but clear. "If they hear, they will not trust," he nodded, his throat too dry for words. She loosened the rope at his wrist just enough for the blood to flow again, then handed him a small piece of bread and a sip of water from a gourd. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. Her eyes lifted to meet his, calm and serious. "Because you do not lie with your eyes," she said. "And because my brother—" She hesitated, glancing toward the chief's lodge. "My brother died near the river." "The one you are blamed for." He froze, unsure what to say. She looked down, her hands tightening on the pouch. He was not a warrior. He went to meet a man. Someone who said he wanted peace between the ranchers and our people. "I do not know what happened after that, only that he never came home." "Then the others found you." The cowboy felt the truth twist painfully in his chest. "If what you're saying is right," he murmured, "then someone set us both up." Her eyes flickered with something like understanding. "There are men on both sides who want no peace," she said. "They profit from hate." She stood then, brushing the dust from her skirt. "At dawn my father will ask the spirits again. You must tell your story." But the men of the tribe will not listen. Only he will. He wanted to ask her more. What she had said before. What those 4 words had meant. But she was already stepping back into the shadows. "What did you tell me earlier?" he whispered urgently. She paused, her face half hidden by the dark. "I said truth walks in fire." Then she was gone. The cowboy sat there, those words burning in his mind. Truth walks in fire. It sounded like a warning, maybe even a promise. But how could truth help him if no one wanted to hear it? By the time the first light of dawn touched the sky, the village was stirring. Smoke rose again from the cooking fires, and the sound of drums began low and slow. The chief's daughter was nowhere to be seen. The guards untied him roughly and pulled him to his feet. His legs felt weak from the long night, but he forced himself to stand tall. The people gathered once more around the clearing. The chief stood before the fire, his face solemn. The cowboy could see the pain in his eyes now. The pain of a father who had buried his son. He couldn't blame him for wanting blood. "You will speak," the chief said. "Tell your story and we will listen." So he told it. Every word. From the rancher's plea to the trail, the missing boy, and the gunfire by the river. He told them about the footprints, the smoke, and the fallen warrior. He didn't try to defend himself. He just told what he saw. When he finished, there was silence. The chief looked at him for a long time, then turned to the council. They spoke in their language, low and heated. The cowboy couldn't understand, but he could feel the weight of their debate. Finally, one of the younger warriors stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. He pointed at the cowboy and shouted something sharp. The crowd murmured in agreement. The warrior's brother had been the one killed. That much the cowboy now understood. The chief raised his hand for silence, but it was clear the mood had shifted. The people wanted justice, and to them, justice looked a lot like vengeance. Before the chief could speak, a cry rose from the edge of the camp. An older woman came running, her voice urgent. Behind her, 2 men carried something wrapped in cloth. They laid it before the fire. When they pulled the blanket back, the crowd gasped. It was Eli, the missing ranch hand. He was alive, barely. His face was pale, his clothes torn and bloodied. He had been shot, but the wound was bound crudely. His lips moved as he tried to speak, and one of the warriors crouched beside him. The cowboy's heart pounded. "Eli!" he shouted. The boy's eyes flickered open, dazed and unfocused. He looked at the cowboy, then at the chief. "It wasn't him," he croaked. There was another man, a white man. He fired first. Chaos rippled through the crowd. The warrior who had accused the cowboy stepped back in confusion. The chief knelt beside the wounded boy, his face hardening. "Who?" he asked. Eli swallowed painfully. "Name was Cutter. Said he'd pay us both if we led him to the Apache trail. But he lied. Shot your son when he tried to stop him." The words came out in gasps, but they were enough. The camp erupted in noise, shouting, anger, disbelief. The cowboy could only stare, the truth finally breaking open like thunder. Cutter, a bounty hunter, known for stirring trouble wherever he went. He'd used them both as pawns. The chief rose slowly, his expression dark. "If this is true," he said, "then a man of your kind has killed my son. Not you, but one of your people. And that blood cries out for balance." The cowboy nodded, his throat tight. "Then let me help you find him." The chief studied him for a long time, then turned to his daughter, who had appeared silently at his side. She said something in Apache, short, firm, unshaken. The old man's eyes softened slightly, and he gave a single nod. The cowboy didn't know what she said, but it changed the air between them. The chief faced him again. "If you speak truth, you will ride with my men," he said. "You will find this Cutter and bring him to the fire. Only then will your debt be clear. Relief and fear tangled in the cowboy's chest. It wasn't freedom, not yet. It was a chance, and maybe that was enough. As the sun climbed higher, the camp broke into motion. Warriors prepared their horses, sharpening their knives, tightening saddle straps. The chief's daughter handed the cowboy a canteen and a piece of jerky, her eyes steady on his. "You will walk in fire before this ends," she said quietly. "But remember, truth always finds its way through." He met her gaze, realizing that whatever fate waited ahead, it was tied to her words, and to this tribe that had once been his enemy. When they rode out from the village, the wind carried the sound of drums behind them. The cowboy glanced back one last time, seeing the smoke rise against the morning sky, wondering if he would ever return. The desert stretched before them, wide and unforgiving, the trail uncertain. Somewhere out there, Cutter rode free, and the line between justice and revenge was already starting to blur. The desert stretched before them like a living thing, silent, endless, and waiting. Heat shimmered on the horizon as the small Apache hunting party rode across the dry flats, their horses kicking up faint trails of dust. The cowboy rode in the middle, his wrists now free but his mind still bound by the weight of what lay ahead. Cutter's name burned in his thoughts like a brand. He'd known the man once, years back in Dodge, when both had ridden for a cattle outfit that paid more in danger than dollars. Cutter had always been a hard man, the kind who'd shoot first and make excuses later. If he was behind the killing, then everything that had happened, all the blood and fear, had started with him. The chief's daughter rode near the front, quiet and alert. Her name, he had learned, was Ayanna. She spoke little, but the warriors listened when she did. Her presence seemed to steady the group, as though her father's authority rode with her. The cowboy noticed the way the others respected her, not just because she was the chief's daughter, but because she carried herself with calm strength. By midday, they stopped beneath a ridge of sandstone cliffs. The air trembled with heat, and the smell of sage and dust filled their lungs. One of the Apache scouts dismounted and knelt, pressing his fingers into the ground. He called softly to Ayanna, who rode up beside him. The scout spoke in Apache, and though the cowboy couldn't understand, he caught a few words: horse tracks, fresh, and north trail. Ayanna turned to him. "Your man was here. 2 days ahead, maybe less," he nodded. "He'll be heading toward the old mining camp in the hills. There's shelter there and water." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You know this land?" "Some," he said. "Enough to know Cutter won't stay in one place long. He's a snake. When trouble comes close, he slithers into another hole." That earned him the faintest flicker of a smile, gone as quickly as it came. They rested only long enough to water the horses. The cowboy shared what little he knew about Cutter's ways, how he'd worked as a bounty man, trading lives for coin, how he'd often stirred up conflict between settlers and tribes to make profit from fear. He'd heard talk that Cutter sometimes sold stolen cattle, even weapons, across both lines. Ayanna listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "Then this man brings war for gold," she said softly. "He is not the first, but he may be the last if my father has his way." They rode again, shadows stretching longer across the sand. The cowboy couldn't help but notice how the land seemed both cruel and beautiful. The red cliffs rising like walls of fire, the dry creek beds twisting like old scars. It was a place built on endurance, a place that forgave no one easily. As night came, they made camp near a cluster of boulders where the wind whistled low. The warriors built a small fire, careful to keep it hidden. Ayanna sat across from the cowboy, sharpening a knife with steady hands. He broke the silence first. "You said back in the village that your brother met someone by the river. You think it was Cutter?" She looked up slowly. "Yes, he came with a white flag. My brother believed he meant peace. I told him not to trust, but he said the land was tired of blood." Her voice caught slightly, though she quickly steadied it. "He never came home." The cowboy looked into the fire. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said simply. "Too good for a world that doesn't want peace." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant call of coyotes. Around them, the warriors settled in, speaking softly in their language. The cowboy felt the old ache of guilt stirring in him. Maybe he hadn't pulled the trigger, but he'd still carried the kind of face that made men like Cutter's lies believable. To these people, he was a reminder of every broken promise the frontier had ever offered. Before dawn, a scout returned from watch. He spoke quickly to Ayanna, who woke the others. The cowboy rose, stiff from sleep. "What is it?" Smoke, she said. To the north. Not far. They packed up and rode hard through the morning light, following the trail that led into a rocky canyon. The air was sharp with the smell of ash before they saw it. A burned wagon still smoldering, and the remains of a small camp scattered across the sand. The cowboy's gut tightened. He dismounted, crouching beside the ashes. A hat lay nearby. Singed but familiar. The rancher who'd hired him to find Eli. The same man who had begged him to bring the boy home. He's dead, the cowboy said quietly. Ayanna's gaze swept over the wreckage. Your cutter did this? He nodded grimly. Looks like his work. He leaves fire behind every time. The Apache warriors spread out, searching the ground for signs. One of them found fresh hoofprints heading west. Ayanna knelt beside them. 2 riders, she said. One may be hurt. The cowboy's pulse quickened. Then he's got someone with him. Maybe a hostage. She looked at him, the question clear in her eyes. Could be Eli, he said. If Cutter's smart, he'll keep the boy alive. He'll need leverage if he runs into soldiers or Apaches again. They followed the trail through the canyon, the air growing cooler as clouds gathered overhead. The sun faded behind a sheet of gray, and thunder grumbled faintly in the distance. It was the first sign of rain in weeks, but the cowboy felt no relief. Storms had a way of hiding things, tracks, scents, and sometimes truth itself. By midday, they reached the edge of a narrow gorge. The trail curved down into it, twisting between sharp rocks. The Apache scout raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He pointed to a ledge high above. There, faint but clear, a figure on horseback moved across the ridge. Cutter. The cowboy's heart jumped. Even from that distance, he recognized the man's posture. Shoulders hunched, hat pulled low, rifle slung across his back. Behind him, another rider sagged in the saddle, tied to the horse's horn. It's him, the cowboy whispered. Ayanna studied the ridge carefully. We cannot attack from here, she said. He will see us coming. He's heading toward the old silver mine, the cowboy said. It's only a few miles from here. He'll hole up there. Narrow tunnels, one way in and one way out. She nodded. Then we wait until nightfall. As they withdrew into the cover of the rocks, the cowboy felt the weight of what was coming. If Cutter reached that mine, there'd be no easy way to take him alive. He'd dig in, make a stand, and there'd be blood before it was over. When the rain began to fall, it came suddenly, cold and heavy, drumming against the stone. The smell of wet earth filled the air, washing away the dust and the tracks with it. They huddled under a rock shelf, the fire they had built quickly snuffed out by the storm. In the dim light, Ayanna turned to him. You will face this man, she said. When you find him, what will you do? He stared out into the rain. Bring him back to your father, alive if I can. But if I can't, he didn't finish the sentence. Her gaze stayed on him, calm but piercing. Killing him will not heal what was broken. He nodded slowly. Maybe not, but it might stop more breaking. The rain eased near dusk, leaving behind the scent of pine and smoke. They rode on, silent shadows against the wet earth. The land grew rougher, the air colder. When they crested the next ridge, the old mine came into view, a gash in the rock with broken timbers framing its mouth. A faint fire flickered inside. Cutter was there. The Apache warriors dismounted and spread out, taking positions along the rocks. Ayanna crouched beside the cowboy. We go in together, she said. But if he fires, you take cover. My people will end this. He shook his head. He's my responsibility. You speak of honor, she said softly. But honor without reason is only pride. Before he could answer, a gunshot cracked through the air, the sound echoing down the canyon walls. One of the warriors fell, clutching his arm. Another bullet struck the rock near Ayanna's head, sending splinters flying. Down! The cowboy shouted, pulling her behind a boulder. Cutter's voice rang out from the mine entrance, harsh and mocking. I see you down there? Thought you could drag me back, didn't you? Well, come on then. Let's see who bleeds first. The cowboy's jaw tightened. The rain had stopped, but thunder still rumbled beyond the hills. He looked at Ayanna, who was already signaling the others to flank around. The storm hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. And in that narrow canyon under the shadow of the mine, both truth and vengeance waited to show their teeth. The cowboy checked his revolver, feeling the weight of every bullet. The moment had come, though he didn't know whether it would end in justice or death. Beside him, Ayanna whispered something, a short phrase in Apache that he couldn't understand but somehow felt. Then they moved together through the dark, the firelight from the mine flickering ahead, the echo of Cutter's laughter cutting through the silence like a blade. The air inside the canyon was thick with tension, heavy with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. The cowboy crouched behind a boulder, his revolver slick in his hand from the rain. Cutter's voice echoed out from the mouth of the mine, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the stone walls like the call of some wild cornered beast. "You think the Apaches will let you live, boy?" Cutter shouted. "They'll turn on you soon as they get what they want. You'll die out here, same as me." The cowboy didn't answer. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the black opening ahead. He could see the faint flicker of the fire inside, the shadow of movement behind it. Cutter was using the old tunnels to his advantage, just like he'd guessed. There'd be traps, narrow spots where one bullet could end it. Ayanna knelt beside him, her hair plastered to her cheeks from the rain. "He taunts you," she said quietly. "He wants you to act in anger." "I know," the cowboy said. "That's how he's always worked. Find the weak spot, pull until something breaks." The Apache warriors were spread along the ridge, silent and watchful, waiting for Ayanna's signal. The storm cloud still hung low over the canyon, and lightning flashed somewhere far off, lighting the rocks in white bursts. Then came another sound, a low groan, faint and pained. It came from deeper inside the mine. The cowboy froze. "That's Eli," he whispered. Ayanna nodded once. "He lives," Cutter's laughter echoed again. "Boy's still breathing, and for now. But you best move fast, friend, or he won't be for long." The cowboy's stomach turned. Cutter wasn't bluffing. He never did when he wanted to push someone over the edge. He looked toward Ayanna, who was already studying the shadows and the slope of the canyon walls. "We can't rush in," she said. "He'll be waiting." He glanced at the ridge above. "If your men circle wide, they can come in from the back tunnel. There's another entrance, a vent shaft that connects to the main chamber. Cutter doesn't know that." Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "You've been here before?" "Years ago," he said. "This mine's older than most of the graves in town. I worked it one summer before it shut down. It's half collapsed, but the vent should still be open." She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Show us." The cowboy led them around the ridge, climbing a narrow path that wound up toward the cliffs. The rain had softened the ground, making it slick and dangerous. The horses were left behind. Each step had to be careful. One slip, and they'd tumble into the rocks below. They reached the top just as the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the cliff. The cowboy pointed toward a dark opening half hidden by brush and stones. "There," he said. "That leads into the back tunnels. It'll take us close to the main chamber, maybe 20 yards behind where Cutter's holed up." Ayanna signaled 2 of the warriors to follow her, while the others stayed behind to cover the main entrance. The cowboy went last, crouching low as they slipped into the narrow passage. The air was cold and damp inside, carrying the smell of rust and earth. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, steady drops. Their footsteps were nearly silent, but every sound felt louder in that tight space. The cowboy could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, and the faint whisper of Ayanna's breath ahead. The tunnel twisted once, then opened slightly into a wider shaft. From there he could see faint light flickering ahead, the glow of Cutter's fire. They crouched in silence, listening. Cutter's voice came again, lower this time, talking to himself or to the boy. "Didn't mean for it to go this way, kid," he said. "But your friend out there, he's too soft. Always was. The frontier don't have room for soft men," Eli's weak voice replied, trembling. You killed him. You killed her brother." "Don't act like you didn't know," Cutter snapped. "That fool thought we were bringing peace. Peace don't fill a man's belly. Gold does." The cowboy's blood ran cold. The truth hit like a hammer. Cutter hadn't just used the boy. He'd used the chief's son, too. He'd promised them both safety, then turned his gun on anyone who got in the way. Ayanna's face was stone, her eyes burning in the dim light. She raised her hand, signaling the warriors to wait. The cowboy leaned close. "If we take him now, we can end this without more blood," he whispered. Her gaze flickered toward him. "Can you promise that?" He couldn't. From the main entrance came a sudden shout, one of the warriors calling out, then the crack of a rifle. Cutter fired again, the sound deafening in the tunnels. Dust and splinters rained from the ceiling. "He's seen them," the cowboy hissed. "We have to move!" Ayanna nodded sharply, and together they surged forward, staying low. The firelight grew brighter, until they could see into the main chamber. Cutter stood near the center, half hidden behind a stack of fallen beams. Eli was tied to a post beside the wall, pale but alive. The boy's eyes widened when he saw them. Cutter turned at the sound, his rifle swinging toward the movement. "Knew you'd come sneaking in behind me," he growled. "Just like always, hiding behind others to do your killing." The cowboy stepped out, gun raised. "You don't get to talk about killing, Cutter. Not after what you did." Cutter's grin twisted beneath his beard. "You think you're better than me? You rode with the same men I did. You took the same pay. Difference is I stopped pretending it meant something." Ayanna and her warriors spread out silently, closing the circle. Cutter's eyes flicked between them, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Looks like I'm outnumbered," he said. "But I still got the only thing you care about." He yanked Eli forward, pressing the rifle barrel to the boy's chest. The cowboy froze. "Don't do it, Cutter. Don't tell me what to do," Cutter roared. His voice echoed off the walls. "You think they'll let you live when this is over? You're just another white fool in their land. You'll die the moment they don't need you." Ayanna stepped forward slowly, her voice calm but firm. "Let the boy go," she said. "This is not your fight," Cutter laughed, sharp and bitter. "Oh, it's my fight, all right. Always was. Men like me, we fight just to stay breathing. That's the only law that ever mattered." Lightning flashed again outside the mine, lighting the chamber for an instant. The cowboy's eyes caught something. The loose rock above Cutter's head, cracked and trembling from the gunfire. One more shot and the ceiling could come down. He met Ayanna's gaze. She saw it too. Cutter's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that instant everything seemed to slow. The boy struggled, the fire flared, and a gust of wind swept through the tunnel. The cowboy shifted his aim, not at Cutter, but at the rock above him. He fired. The explosion of sound filled the chamber. Cutter flinched, jerking back as stone and dust rained down. He fired wildly in return, the bullet grazing the cowboy's arm. The pain was sharp, hot, but he kept moving, diving for cover. Ayanna shouted a command, and the warriors surged forward, their movements swift and sure. More gunfire, more shouting, the sound of boots on rock, the clatter of weapons. The mine shook with the chaos of it. Cutter stumbled through the dust, coughing, his rifle jammed. He swung it like a club, knocking one of the warriors aside. The cowboy rose, his revolver empty. He threw it aside and tackled Cutter, both men crashing into the dirt. They grappled, their fists striking hard and fast. Years of anger and betrayal poured out in every blow. Cutter was strong, wild, desperate. But the cowboy fought with something deeper, something that came from the weight of everything he'd lost. Ayanna ran to untie Eli, pulling the boy away as the fight raged. The tunnel ceiling groaned, dust falling like rain. The firelight flickered dangerously close to a pile of dry timber. "Get him out," the cowboy shouted over the roar. "Go!" Ayanna hesitated for just a heartbeat, her eyes locked on the struggle. Then she pulled Eli toward the exit, shouting for the others to follow. Cutter lunged, his hands closing around the cowboy's throat. "You should have stayed out of it," he snarled. "This land don't want saving." The cowboy gritted his teeth, forcing the man's hands away. "Maybe not," he gasped, "but someone has to try." Another crack thundered through the mine, louder this time, final. The ceiling began to collapse. Cutter's eyes went wide. Outside, Ayanna and the others turned back just in time to see the firelight flare brighter, the entrance filling with dust and smoke. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Then came the sound of the mountain itself giving way. And as the dust swallowed the light, no one knew who, and if anyone, we would come out alive. The rumble of the collapsing mine echoed across the canyon, rolling like thunder long after the mountain fell silent. Dust clouded the air, and the scent of smoke and earth mingled with the coming rain. Ayanna stood near the entrance, her arms around Eli, shielding him as the final stones tumbled down. The boy trembled in her grasp, his face streaked with dirt and tears, whispering the cowboy's name over and over. When the noise finally faded, only the wind remained. The Apache warriors lowered their weapons, the storm above breaking into a soft drizzle. Ayanna took a step forward, her eyes fixed on the blocked tunnel. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Cutter's cruelty had ended, but so, it seemed, had the man who had risked everything to stop him. Hours passed before the rain stopped. The warriors began clearing the rubble quietly, each stone lifted with care and respect. They said little, knowing the earth might hold only one truth now. Ayanna worked beside them, her hands raw and scraped, her breath shallow from exhaustion. Eli wouldn't leave her side, his eyes hollow from shock. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, they had cleared enough to see part of the tunnel again. Smoke still drifted from within, curling like faint ghosts in the light. One of the men called out. He'd found something. A torn piece of cloth, dusty and scorched. It was the cowboy's coat. Ayanna froze. She reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the rubble. Beneath it, she saw a faint movement and a hand bruised but alive. "He lives!" she cried. The warriors rushed forward, clearing the stones with renewed strength. Within moments, they uncovered him, pale, bloodied, but breathing. The cowboy's chest rose and fell weakly. His hat was gone, his face streaked with dust and soot. Ayanna knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his cheek. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding hers. "Thought I was done for," he rasped. "You almost were," she said softly. "But the mountain let you go." He tried to smile, but the pain stopped him. "And Cutter?" Ayanna's gaze fell toward the collapsed passage behind him. "Gone," she said simply. "Buried where his lies belong." The cowboy nodded faintly. "That's one way to end it." They carried him out of the mine and down to the river's edge, where the air was clean and cool. The sky was wide again, streaked with orange from the setting sun. The boy stayed close, refusing to leave his side. Ayanna washed the dust and blood from his face, her movements careful and gentle. "You saved me," Eli whispered. "You came back for me." The cowboy's voice was rough but steady. "I wasn't about to leave you behind. You got more life ahead of you than most men get to dream of." The boy nodded, tears in his eyes. "And you?" He looked at the horizon, where the last light touched the distant hills. "Guess I'll rest a while. Then I'll figure out where I belong." For days they stayed near the river as he healed. The Apache brought food and herbs, tending to his wounds. Though the pain lingered, he found peace in the quiet moments. The way the wind moved through the cottonwoods, the laughter of the children who came to fetch water, the steady rhythm of Ayanna's voice as she spoke in her native tongue. At night, when the stars stretched across the desert sky, he lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp, soft murmurs, the crackle of the fire, the beating heart of a people who had survived everything the frontier had thrown at them. He thought of Cutter then, and all the men like him, the ones who believed that gold and guns were the only truths that mattered. He thought of how wrong they had been. One morning the chief came to him. The old man's face was lined like the land itself, carved by time and sorrow. He sat beside the cowboy and spoke quietly. "You fought for my daughter and for my people," he said. "Few would do that. You have our respect, and our thanks." The cowboy bowed his head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was right." The chief smiled faintly. "That is why the spirit spared you." When he rose to leave, Ayanna remained behind. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You could stay," she said softly. "The land has room for those who honor it. My people would welcome you." He studied her face, the calm strength in her eyes. A part of him wanted nothing more than to stay, to let the world outside fade away. But deep down, he knew he wasn't meant to stop yet. "You've got something worth protecting here," he said gently. "But me, I'm just passing through." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then may the wind guide you kindly." He smiled faintly, reaching for her hand. "And may it always bring me back this way." When he finally rode out, the land was alive with spring again. The rains had brought color back to the valley, green grass along the ridges, wildflowers blooming by the river. Eli rode beside him for a mile or so before turning back, waving until he disappeared behind the hills. The cowboy rode on in silence, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing softly against the earth. The trail stretched long before him, but it didn't feel lonely. Somewhere behind him, he knew there were people rebuilding, healing, finding peace. He reached the edge of the village near sundown. The same old saloon stood there, half leaning from the wind, its sign creaking softly. The people who saw him pass didn't recognize him, or maybe they just didn't want to remember. Too many ghosts lived in those streets. He stopped outside the old church where he'd once taken shelter during a storm. The door hung crooked now, the bell silent. Inside, dust floated in the golden light streaming through the cracks. He sat on the front steps for a while, listening to the quiet. It struck him then how much the world had changed, and how much hadn't. The frontier was still raw and wild, full of people trying to carve a life from the dust. But he'd learned something the others hadn't, that peace didn't come from power or land or gold. It came from mercy, from understanding, from standing between two worlds and refusing to let either fall. When he finally rose, the stars were coming out again. He tightened the strap on his saddle and looked west, where the sky was still burning faintly with the last light of day. He took one last look toward the horizon, then rode off, his shadow stretching long across the desert. Back in the canyon, the river kept running, washing away the last traces of the battle. Grass began to grow again where the fire had been. Ayana often stood by the water at sunset, her eyes drifting toward the hills. She never said it out loud, but she knew. Somewhere out there, the cowboy was still riding, still chasing the wind. Eli grew stronger each day, his spirit mending along with the land. Sometimes he told the younger ones about the man who had come from the white towns, who'd stood between a tribe and a traitor, who'd shown that courage wasn't about where you came from, but what you were willing to protect. The children listened wide-eyed, as though he were talking about a legend. Maybe he was. Years later, when travelers passed through that stretch of land, they sometimes spoke of a lone rider who moved like a shadow at dusk, quiet, watchful, and kind. They said he never stayed long, but wherever he went, trouble seemed to fade soon after, and when the wind moved through the canyon at night, it carried with it a whisper, the sound of a promise kept, that the land could heal, that people could change, and that even in the harshest corners of the old American frontier, hope still found a way to live.